The diamond ring slipped from Damien Cross's fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sound like breaking glass. Across the luxury jewelry store, a woman he'd buried 3 years ago stood frozen behind the counter, clutching a little girl who had his eyes. Please hit the subscribe button, make sure you like and share this story. Comments where you are watching from. Sit back and see what happens next. "Sir, are you all right?" The store manager's voice seemed to come from underwater as Damien stared at the impossible sight before him. His ex-wife, Zara, the woman whose funeral he had attended, whose grave he'd visited every year on their anniversary, was very much alive and working as a salesgirl in prestige diamonds. But that wasn't what made his blood turn to ice. The child in her arms, no more than 3 years old, turned to look at him with eyes that were mirror images of his own, dark, intense, and far too knowing for someone so young. The little girl tilted her head exactly the way Damien did when he was thinking, a gesture so familiar it felt like looking into the past. "Damien?" Camilla's concerned voice broke through his shock. His fiancée knelt to pick up the fallen ring, her designer dress pooling around her like spilled wine. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." If only she knew how accurate that statement was. 30 minutes earlier, Damien had walked into this store as one of the most feared men in the city, ready to choose wedding rings and finally leave his violent past behind. He'd survived assassination attempts, gang wars, and betrayals that would have destroyed weaker men. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. Zara's face had gone completely white, and she was backing away from the counter as if Damien were a loaded gun pointed at her heart. The little girl in her arms watched everything with those unnervingly familiar eyes, her small hand reaching out toward Damien as if she recognized something in him. "Mama," the child whispered, her voice carrying across the silent store. "Why does the scary man look like me?" The question hit Damien like a physical blow. He'd built an empire on violence and fear, had killed men with his bare hands, had stared death in the face more times than he could count. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. Zara's face had gone completely white, and she was backing away from the counter as if Damien were a loaded gun pointed at her heart. The little girl in her arms watched everything with those unnervingly familiar eyes, her small hand reaching out toward Damien as if she recognized something in him. "Mama," the child spoke again, her innocent voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Is that my daddy?" The words echoed through the store, and Damien felt his entire world shift on its axis. Customers turned to stare. The store manager looked mortified, and Camilla's engagement ring slipped from her fingers to join Damien's on the marble floor. But that was all Damien could see, as Zara's face crumbled as her carefully constructed lie fell apart, and the little girl who was reaching for him with tiny hands that looked exactly like his own.
4 years earlier, Damien Cross had been a different man, or at least he'd tried to be. The penthouse overlooking the city's skyline had been filled with laughter then, with the sound of Zara's voice calling his name when she came home from her art gallery job. She'd transformed his cold, sterile apartment into something that felt like a home, with fresh flowers on every table and paintings that brought color to his black and white world. "You're late again," Zara had said that Tuesday evening, not looking up from the canvas she was working on in the corner of their living room. Her voice held no accusation, just the tired resignation of a woman who'd grown used to disappointment. Damien had stood in the doorway, still wearing his blood-stained shirt beneath his jacket, watching the woman he loved create something beautiful while he destroyed everything he touched. Business ran long. He'd lied, the same lie he'd been telling for months. She'd finally looked at him then, her green eyes taking in the cuts on his knuckles, the way he favored his left side where a rival's knife had found its mark. "What kind of business, Damien? You never tell me anything real anymore." That was the problem with loving someone like Zara. She saw too much, understood too much. She'd fallen in love with the man he pretended to be during daylight hours, the successful businessman who donated to charities and attended gallery openings. She had no idea that the same hands that held her so gently had strangled a man just hours before. Import and export, he'd said, the same vague answer he always gave. Nothing you need to worry about. But Zara had been worrying for months. She'd started asking questions about his late nights, about the men in expensive suits who came to their home at odd hours, about why he carried a gun to business meetings. Damien had deflected every inquiry with kisses and expensive gifts, thinking he could buy her silence the way he bought everything else. "I'm not stupid, Damien," she'd whispered that night as they lay in bed, her head on his chest. "I know you're not just importing coffee beans, or whatever story you told me this week. The way people look at you when we're out, the way they're afraid to even make eye contact, that's not respect for a businessman. That's fear." He wanted to tell her the truth then, wanted to explain that he'd inherited this life from his father, that he'd tried to go legitimate, but the family business had claws that wouldn't let him go. Instead, he'd kissed the top of her head and promised things would change. They never did. The breaking point had come 6 months later, on a rainy Thursday that started like any other day. Zara had been homesick with the flu, curled up on their couch watching old movies when Damien's past had literally broken down their door. 3 men from the Castellano family had burst into their penthouse, looking for Damien and the money they claimed he'd stolen from their last shipment. They'd found Zara instead, alone and defenseless, wearing nothing but one of Damien's shirts. "Where's your husband, pretty lady?" the leader had asked, his voice like gravel as he'd grabbed Zara by the hair. "He's got something that belongs to us." Zara had tried to run, had made it halfway to the bedroom before they'd caught her. By the time Damien arrived an hour later, she was tied to a chair with a gun pressed to her temple, tears streaming down her bruised face. The violence that followed was swift and brutal. Damien had killed all 3 men with his bare hands, his rage so complete that he'd barely remembered doing it. When the red haze cleared, Zara was staring at him like he was a monster she'd never seen before. "This is who you really are," she'd whispered, looking at the blood on his hands, the bodies scattered across their living room floor. "This is what you've been hiding from me." He'd tried to explain, tried to make her understand that he'd done it to protect her, that he'd had no choice. But Zara saw the truth in his eyes. This wasn't the first time he'd killed, and it wouldn't be the last. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said, her voice breaking. "I can't love someone who lives like this. I can't bring children into this world." Children. The word hit him like a physical blow, because they'd been trying for a baby, had been talking about starting a family. Now she was telling him that future was impossible. "I'll change," he'd promised, kneeling beside her chair as he untied her bonds. But Zara had shaken her head, her decision already made. "You can't change, Damien. This is who you are, and I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore." She'd packed a single bag that night, while he cleaned up the bodies, while he made the calls to have the mess disappear. When he'd finished, she was gone, leaving only a note that said she was sorry, but she couldn't live in his darkness anymore. He'd never seen her again. Until today.
The silence in Prestige Diamonds stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Camila stood frozen, her engagement ring still rolling across the marble floor, while customers throughout the store pretended not to stare at the unfolding drama. The little girl's innocent question, "Is that my daddy?" hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Zara's face had gone from white to gray, and she clutched the child tighter against her chest. "Ivy, sweetheart, why don't you go color in the back room?" she whispered, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound calm. But Ivy wasn't moving. Those dark eyes, Damien's eyes, remained fixed on his face with an intensity that made his chest ache.
She was studying him the way he studied his enemies, looking for weaknesses, for truth hidden beneath lies. "I want to stay with you, Mama," Ivy said, her small hand reaching toward Damien again. "The man looks sad. Why is he sad?" Camila finally found her voice, though it came out strangled and confused. "Damien, what is she talking about? Who is this woman? Why does that child think you're her father?" The store manager appeared at Damien's elbow, wringing his hands nervously. "Perhaps we should move this conversation to a more private setting? We have a consultation room in the back where you can discuss your family matters without disturbing other customers." Family matters. The words hit Damien like a sledgehammer. He had a family, a daughter he'd never known existed, never held, never read bedtime stories to. 3 years of her life had passed while he'd mourned a woman who was very much alive. "Zara," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "we need to talk, now." She shook her head frantically, backing toward the employee exit. "I can't. I have to work. My shift isn't over until 6, and I can't afford to lose this job." "You're worried about losing a job?" Damien's voice rose slightly, drawing more stares from the other customers. "You let me think you were dead for 3 years. You kept my daughter from me, and you're worried about a job?" "She's not your daughter," Zara said quickly, but the lie was written all over her face. Ivy looked exactly like Damien had as a child, the same dark hair, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. Camila stepped forward, her designer heels clicking on the marble. "I don't understand what's happening here. Damien, you told me you'd never been married before. You said you'd never had any serious relationships." The accusation in her voice cut deep because it was true. Damien had lied to Camila about everything, his past, his business, his first marriage. She thought she was marrying a successful tech entrepreneur, not a man whose hands were stained with blood. "Camila, I can explain," he started, but she was already shaking her head. "Can you? Because right now it looks like you have a secret family that you somehow forgot to mention during our 2 years together." Ivy chose that moment to wriggle out of Zara's arms, her small feet hitting the floor with determination. Before anyone could stop her, she walked straight to Damien and looked up at him with those impossibly familiar eyes. "You have the same hands as me." She held up her tiny palm to compare it to his much larger one. "And the same eyes. Mama says I got my eyes from someone special, but she won't tell me who." Damien knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Ivy's eye level. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. She had his mother's nose, his father's stubborn jawline, and something indefinably his own in the way she carried herself. "What's your favorite color, Ivy?" he asked softly, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Purple," she said, without hesitation. "Like the flowers Mama grows on our windowsill. What's yours?" "I don't know," Damien admitted, realizing he'd never thought about something so simple. "Maybe you could help me figure it out." Zara was beside them in an instant, scooping Ivy back into her arms. "That's enough. Ivy, we need to go, now." But Damien stood up, blocking their path to the exit. "You're not disappearing again. Not this time." "You don't understand," Zara whispered, her eyes darting around the store as if she expected danger to materialize from the shadows. "If people know about her, if they know she exists—" "If who knows?" Damien demanded. "What are you running from, Zara?" Before she could answer, the store's front door chimed, and a man in an expensive black suit walked in. He was tall, lean, with the kind of predatory grace that Damien recognized immediately. This wasn't a customer browsing for jewelry. Zara saw him too, and the color drained completely from her face. "Oh God," she breathed, "they found us." The man's eyes swept the store until they landed on their little group. When he smiled, it was the kind of smile that promised violence. "Hello, Zara,"
he called across the store, his voice carrying easily over the classical music. Ivy, press your face against Zara's shoulder, suddenly understanding that something was very wrong. Mama, I'm scared. Damien's hand moved instinctively toward the gun concealed beneath his jacket as every protective instinct he'd ever possessed roared to life.
The man in the black suit moved through prestige diamonds like a shark cutting through water, his cold smile never wavering as other customers instinctively stepped out of his path. Damien recognized the type immediately, a professional killer trying to look like a businessman, the kind of predator who could slit your throat while discussing the weather. "Marcus Volkov," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible as she clutched Ivy tighter. "He works for the Kozlov family." Damien's blood turned to ice. The Kozlovs were Russian mob, the kind of people who made his own organization look like choir boys. They specialized in human trafficking, organ harvesting, and making people disappear so completely that even their shadows ceased to exist. "Mama, who is that man?" Ivy asked, her small voice muffled against Zara's shoulder. Even at 3 years old, she could sense the danger radiating from Volkov like heat from a fire. "Nobody important, sweetheart," Zara lied, but her hands were shaking as she tried to shield Ivy from Volkov's view. "Just a customer." Camila looked between them all, confusion and fear warring on her face. "Damien, what's happening? Who are these people?" But Damien couldn't answer because Volkov was approaching their little group, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. The store manager had disappeared, probably hiding in his office and pretending not to see anything that might require him to call the police. "Zara Blackthorn," Volkov said, his Russian accent thick as honey. "Or should I say, Zara Cross. You've been very difficult to find." "I don't know what you're talking about," Zara said, but her voice cracked on the words. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I think you have me confused with someone else." Volkov laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Sarah Mitchell, the identity you purchased from Dr. Helena Voss 3 years ago. Very expensive, very thorough. New social security number, new birth certificate, even new dental records. The good doctor does excellent work." Damien's mind raced. Dr. Voss was a black market surgeon who specialized in helping people disappear for the right price. She created new identities for witnesses and protection programs, for criminals fleeing prosecution, for anyone desperate enough to pay her astronomical fees. "What do you want?" Damien stepped forward, placing himself between Volkov and his family. The word family hit him like a physical blow. When had he started thinking of them that way? Volkov's cold eyes shifted to Damien and his smile widened. "Ah, the famous Damien Cross. Your reputation precedes you, though I must say you look different than I expected. Softer, perhaps. Love does that to a man, doesn't it?" "Answer my question," Damien said, his voice dropping to the dangerous tone that had made grown men wet themselves in fear. "Ex-wife," Camila corrected sharply, but her voice was shaking. "Right? She's your ex-wife." Volkov clapped his hands together slowly, mockingly. "Oh, this is delicious. The great Damien Cross, brought low by domestic drama. But I'm afraid this isn't about your marital problems, Mr. Cross. This is about a debt that needs to be paid." Zara's face went even whiter, if that was possible. "I told you I don't have the money. I've been working minimum wage jobs for 3 years. I barely have enough to feed my daughter." "Our daughter," Damien corrected automatically, then froze as he realized what Zara had just admitted. She owed money to the Russian mob, dangerous, life-threatening amounts of money judging by the fact that they'd sent Volkov to collect. "What debt? How much does she owe?" Volkov pulled out his phone and showed them a number that made even Damien's stomach drop. $2 million, plus interest that had been compounding for 3 years. It was enough money to buy a small country or to justify killing an entire family. "You see," Volkov explained conversationally, "when dear Zara needed to disappear so urgently 3 years ago, she came to us for help. New identity, safe passage out of the country, protection from whoever she was running from.
We provided all of these services, naturally. I was running from him, Zara said, nodding toward Damien. From his world, from the violence that followed him everywhere. I thought if I disappeared completely, if I became someone else, maybe I could give my baby a normal life. Ivy had been listening to everything with those two intelligent eyes, and now she looked up at Damien with something that might have been recognition. Are you the bad man Mama was scared of? The question hit Damien harder than any bullet ever had. His own daughter thought he was the monster her mother had been running from, and maybe she was right. The problem, Volkov continued, is that Zara never paid our services. She took out help and then vanished, thinking she could hide forever. But nobody hides from the Kozlov family forever. I'll pay the debt, Damien said immediately. Transfer the money to whatever account you want. Just leave them alone. Volkov's smile turned predatory. Oh, Mr. Cross, if only it were so simple. You see, the debt isn't just about money anymore. It's about respect, about making sure people understand what happens when they try to cheat us. He pulled out a gun, keeping it low and hidden from the other customers. The child comes with me. Consider it collateral until the debt is paid in full.
The world exploded into chaos the moment Volkov reached for Ivy. Damien moved faster than he had in years, his hand finding the Glock concealed beneath his jacket as he stepped between the Russian and his daughter. But Volkov was ready for him, his own weapon already trained on Ivy's small form in Zara's arms. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Cross," Volkov said calmly, his finger resting on the trigger. "One wrong move, and the little girl pays the price." Around them, the jewelry store erupted in screams as customers finally realized what was happening. A woman in pearls dropped her champagne glass, the crystals shattering against the marble floor. The store manager was frantically pressing buttons on his phone, probably calling security, but Damien knew they'd never arrive in time. "Please," Zara whispered, her voice breaking as she held Ivy closer. "She's just a baby. She doesn't understand any of this." But Ivy was understanding more than any of them realized. Those dark eyes, so much like Damien's own, were taking in everything with frightening intelligence. She wasn't crying or screaming like most children would. Instead, she was watching Volkov with the kind of calculating stare that reminded Damien uncomfortably of himself. "Mama," Ivy said quietly, her small voice cutting through the chaos. "The bad man has a gun." Camila let out a strangled sob from somewhere behind them. "Damien, do something. Call the police. Call someone." But Damien knew the police wouldn't help. By the time they arrived, Volkov would be gone with Ivy, and they'd never see her again. The Kozlov family had connections everywhere. Judges, cops, politicians. They could make a 3-year-old girl disappear as easily as erasing a name from a list. "You want money?" Damien said, his voice deadly calm, despite the rage burning in his chest. "I'll give you 10 million, right now. Transfer it to any account you want." Volkov naffed, the sound echoing off the store's high ceilings. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about money anymore. Your wife humiliated us. She made us look weak. In our business, reputation is everything." "Ex-wife," Camila corrected again, but her voice was barely a whisper now. "The child comes with me," Volkov continued, taking a step closer. "She'll be returned when the debt is paid in full, principal, interest, and a penalty for the disrespect shown to my employers. Call it educational insurance." That's when Damien saw it, a flash of movement in his peripheral vision. Zara was slowly reaching into her purse with her free hand, her movements so subtle that Volkov hadn't noticed. But Damien had spent years reading people's intentions, and he recognized the careful precision of someone reaching for a weapon. His ex-wife was armed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Zara he'd known 3 years ago had been terrified of violence, had begged him to get rid of his guns, had cried when she'd seen blood on his clothes. But this Zara, this woman who'd survived 3 years on the run from the Russian mob, was a different person entirely. "You know what I think?" Damien said, buying her time as he kept Volkov's attention focused on him. "I think you're bluffing. I think your bosses sent you here alone because they don't actually care about the money. They just want to send a message." Volkov's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're wrong, Mr. Cross, but you're about to find out just how serious we are." He started to reach for Ivy, and that's when everything went to hell. Zara's hand came out of her purse holding a small pistol, a .22 caliber, barely bigger than her palm, but deadly at close range. She didn't hesitate, didn't warn him, didn't give him a chance to surrender. She simply pulled the trigger. The shot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, and Volkov stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. But he didn't drop his gun, and his finger was still on the trigger pointed at Ivy. "You stupid bitch! Now you've made this personal," he snarled, raising his weapon towards Zara's head. Damien didn't think. He moved on pure instinct, tackling Volkov around the waist and driving him backward into a display case full of diamond necklaces. Glass exploded around them as they hit the floor, and Volkov's gun went skittering across the marble. They rolled across the broken glass, each man fighting for dominance, for survival, for the right to protect what mattered most. Volkov was younger, faster, but Damien fought with the desperate fury of a father protecting his child. "Run!" Damien shouted at Zara as he wrapped his hands around Volkov's throat. "Take Ivy and run!" But Zara wasn't running. She was standing over them with her small pistol trained on Volkov's head, her hands steady despite everything that had just happened. "Let him go, Damien," Zara said quietly. "I've got this." Volkov laughed even as Damien's hands tightened around his windpipe. "You think killing me will solve anything? There are dozens more where I came from." "Maybe," Zara said, cold as winter, "but you won't be around to see them." That's when Damien realized the truth that changed everything. His ex-wife hadn't just been running from the Russian mob for 3 years. She'd been hunting them, and now they'd walked right into her trap. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer by the second. But Damien knew that by the time help arrived, this would all be over, one way or another. Ivy's small voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "Mama, are you going to hurt the bad man?" The silence and prestige diamond stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Camila stood frozen, her engagement ring still rolling across the marble floor, while customers throughout the store pretended not to stare at the unfolding drama. The little girl's innocent question, "Is that my daddy?" hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Zara's face had gone from white to gray, and she clutched the child tighter against her chest. "Ivy, sweetheart, why don't you go color in the back room?" she whispered, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound calm. But Ivy wasn't moving. Those dark eyes, so much like Damien's own, were taking in everything with frightening intelligence. She wasn't crying or screaming like most children would. Instead, she was watching Volkov with the kind of calculating stare that reminded Damien uncomfortably of himself. "Mama," Ivy said quietly, her small voice cutting through the chaos. "The bad man has a gun." Camila let out a strangled sob from somewhere behind them. "Damien, do something. Call the police. Call someone." But Damien knew the police wouldn't help. By the time they arrived, Volkov would be gone with Ivy, and they'd never see her again. The Kozlov family had connections everywhere. Judges, cops, politicians. They could make a 3-year-old girl disappear as easily as erasing a name from a list. "You want money?" Damien said, his voice deadly calm, despite the rage burning in his chest. "I'll give you 10 million, right now. Transfer it to any account you want." Volkov laughed, the sound echoing off the store's high ceilings. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about money anymore. Your wife humiliated us. She made us look weak. In our business, reputation is everything." "Ex-wife," Camila corrected again, but her voice was barely a whisper now. "The child comes with me," Volkov continued, taking a step closer.
She'll be returned when the debt is paid in full, principal, interest, and a penalty for the disrespect shown to my employers. Call it educational insurance. That's when Damien saw it, a flash of movement in his peripheral vision. Zara was slowly reaching into her purse with her free hand, her movements so subtle that Volkov hadn't noticed. But Damien had spent years reading people's intentions, and he recognized the careful precision of someone reaching for a weapon. His ex-wife was armed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Zara he'd known 3 years ago had been terrified of violence, had begged him to get rid of his guns, had cried when she'd seen blood on his clothes. But this Zara, this woman who'd survived 3 years on the run from the Russian mob, was a different person entirely. "You know what I think?" Damien said, buying her time as he kept Volkov's attention focused on him. "I think you're bluffing. I think your bosses sent you here alone because they don't actually care about the money. They just want to send a message." Volkov's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're wrong, Mr. Cross, but you're about to find out just how serious we are." He started to reach for Ivy, and that's when everything went to hell. Zara's hand came out of her purse holding a small pistol, a .22 caliber, barely bigger than her palm, but deadly at close range. She didn't hesitate, didn't warn him, didn't give him a chance to surrender. She simply pulled the trigger. The shot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, and Volkov stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. But he didn't drop his gun, and his finger was still on the trigger pointed at Ivy. "You stupid bitch! Now you've made this personal," he snarled, raising his weapon toward Zara's head. Damien didn't think. He moved on pure instinct, tackling Volkov around the waist and driving him backward into a display case full of diamond necklaces. Glass exploded around them as they hit the floor, and Volkov's gun went skittering across the marble. They rolled across the broken glass, each man fighting for dominance.
The sirens were getting closer, but Zara's finger remained steady on the trigger as she stared down at Volkov. Blood from his shoulder wound was spreading across the white marble floor, mixing with shattered glass from the destroyed display case. "Answer my daughter," Zara said, her voice colder than Damien had ever heard it. "Are you going to hurt the bad man, Mama?" Ivy stood perfectly still near the jewelry counter, her small hands pressed against her ears to block out the chaos. But those dark eyes, Damien's eyes, never left her mother's face, waiting for an answer that would define everything she understood about right and wrong. "Sometimes, sweetheart," Zara said softly, never taking her aim off Volkov, "we have to stop bad people from hurting good people, even if it means doing something scary." Damien loosened his grip on Volkov's throat, suddenly understanding that he was seeing a side of Zara he'd never known existed. This wasn't the terrified woman who'd fled from his world 3 years ago. This was someone who'd been forged in fire, shaped by desperation and the need to protect their child. "You've been planning this," he said, the pieces falling into place. "The job at the jewelry store, being here when I came to buy rings, none of this was coincidence." Zara's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I've been tracking Volkov for 6 months. I knew he'd eventually trace my new identity back to Dr. Voss, and I knew he'd come looking for me. I just needed to choose the battlefield." Volkov coughed, blood speckling his lips. "You think you're so clever, but you have no idea what you started. The Kozlov family doesn't forgive. They don't forget." "Neither do I," Zara replied. "You killed Dr. Voss last week, didn't you? Cut her throat in her own clinic because she wouldn't give up my location." Damien's blood turned to ice. Dr. Voss had been found dead in her underground medical facility, her murder so brutal that even the police had been shaken. If Volkov had killed her to get to Zara. Helena was a good woman. She helped people disappear when they had nowhere else to go. She saved my life, gave me a chance to protect my daughter, and you butchered her like an animal. Camilla was pressed against the far wall, her face white with shock as she watched the woman she'd thought was just a salesgirl hold a gun on a Russian assassin.
This is insane. This is completely insane. The sirens were almost on top of them now, and Damien could hear car doors slamming outside. In minutes, the store would be swarming with police, and everything would become infinitely more complicated. Zara, we need to go, now, before the cops get here. But she shook her head, her aim never wavering. I'm done running, Damien. I've been running for 3 years, looking over my shoulder, jumping at every shadow. I'm tired of being afraid. Volkov laughed weakly. You should be afraid. You have no idea what's coming for you, what's coming for all of you. What's that supposed to mean? Damien demanded, but Volkov's eyes were already glazing over from blood loss. That's when Ivy spoke up, her small voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Mama, there are more bad men outside. Everyone turned to look at her, and Damien felt his heart stop. Through the store's floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see black SUVs pulling up to the curb, not police cars, vehicles with tinted windows and the kind of aggressive stance that screamed military or private security. Back up, Volkov wheezed, his smile returning despite his injuries. Did you really think I'd come alone? Zara's face went pale as she counted the vehicles. 6 cars, maybe 20 men. They're not here for me, Volkov continued, his voice getting weaker. They're here for the girl. My employers have special plans for her. Damien's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. What kind of plans? The kind that make $2 million look like pocket change. Before anyone could ask what he meant, the store's front door exploded inward as armed men in tactical gear poured through the entrance. They moved with military precision, weapons raised, shouting commands in Russian and English. Down on the ground! Everyone down! Camilla shouted and dropped to her knees, her hands over her head. The few remaining customers who hadn't already fled were doing the same, terror written across their faces. But Damien was already moving, scooping Ivy into his arms as Zara spun to face the new threat. The little girl wrapped her arms around his neck, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she started to cry. It's okay, baby, he whispered into her hair, the words feeling strange on his lips. Daddy's got you. The word daddy felt like coming home and going to war at the same time. There's a back exit, Zara said, backing towards him while keeping her gun trained on the approaching soldiers. But as they turned toward the rear of the store, more armed men appeared from that direction, cutting off their escape route. They were surrounded, trapped in a jewelry store that had become a war zone. The lead soldier, a man with cold blue eyes and scars across his face, stepped over Volkov's bleeding form and smiled at them with predatory satisfaction. Mr. Cross, Mrs. Cross, and little Ivy, we've been looking forward to meeting you. Ivy pressed her face against Damien's shoulder and whispered something that made his blood freeze. Mama, why do the bad men know my name?
The scarred soldier's smile widened as he saw the fear in their eyes. You're wondering how we know so much about little Ivy, aren't you? About her special gifts. Damien held his daughter tighter, his mind racing through escape routes that didn't exist. They were surrounded, outgunned, and trapped in a jewelry store that had become a killing ground. But the soldier's words about Ivy's special gifts sent ice through his veins. What are you talking about? Zara demanded, her gun still trained on the nearest threat despite being hopelessly outnumbered. The soldier gestured to one of his men, who produced a tablet and held it up for them to see. On the screen was a video of Dr. Voss's clinic, but not from last week when she was murdered. This footage was 3 years old, showing a very pregnant Zara lying on an examination table. Dr. Helena Voss was more than just a black market surgeon. She was also a researcher, funded by certain government agencies interested in enhancing human potential. Damien's blood turned to ice as he watched the video. Dr. Voss was injecting something into Zara's IV line, something that made the monitors around her spike and beep frantically. No, Zara whispered, her face going white. She said it was just vitamins,
prenatal supplements to make sure the baby was healthy. In a way, she was telling the truth, the soldier continued. The injections did ensure your daughter's health. They also enhanced her cognitive development in ways we're only beginning to understand. Ivy lifted her head from Damien's shoulder, those dark eyes focusing on the soldier with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "You're lying," she said, her voice far too mature for a 3-year-old. "Dr. Helena was nice. She gave me candy when Mama brought me for checkups." The soldier's eyebrows rose in surprise. Remarkable. Most children her age can barely form complete sentences, yet she speaks with the vocabulary of someone much older. "Smart," Zara laughed. "Mrs. Cross, your daughter has an IQ that's literally off the charts. She can process information at speeds that would make supercomputers jealous. She remembers everything she's ever seen, heard, or experienced with perfect clarity." As if to prove his point, Ivy turned to look at Camilla, who was still crouched on the floor with her hands over her head. "The scared lady is wearing a Cartier watch worth $47,000. She bought it last Tuesday at the boutique on 5th Avenue using a credit card ending in 4829. Camilla's face went white. How could she possibly know that? Because she sees everything, processes everything, remembers everything. Dr. Voss's experiments created the perfect intelligence asset, and certain people are very interested in studying her further. Damien felt rage building in his chest like a nuclear reactor approaching meltdown. "You're not taking her anywhere." "I'm afraid you don't have a choice, Mr. Cross. Your daughter is government property now." That's when Zara made her move. She'd been slowly shifting position while the soldier talked, and now she was close enough to grab a shard of broken glass from the destroyed display case. In one fluid motion, she hurled it at the nearest gunman while diving behind the jewelry counter. The glass caught the soldier in the throat, and he went down gurgling blood. Chaos erupted as his teammates opened fire, bullets shattering display cases and sending diamond rings scattering across the marble floor like deadly confetti. Damien rolled behind a pillar, shielding Ivy with his body as gunfire exploded around them. "Stay down, baby," he whispered into her ear. "Don't look, don't listen, just stay with Daddy." But Ivy was looking, and what she saw made her small body go rigid with terror. "Mama's hurt," she said, her voice cutting through the gunfire like a knife. Damien risked a glance around the pillar and saw Zara slumped behind the counter, blood spreading across her white blouse. She'd been hit in the shoulder, maybe worse, and she wasn't moving. "Zara!" he shouted, but she didn't respond. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the scarred soldier's voice echoed through the smoke-filled store. "Enough! We need the child alive and unharmed. Everyone else is expendable." Damien looked down at Ivy, who was staring at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "Daddy, I know how to stop them." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I remember everything," she said, her voice taking on that eerie maturity again, "including the codes Dr. Helena used to access the government databases, the ones that have all the bad men's real names and addresses." Damien's mind raced. If Ivy had access to classified information, if she could expose the people behind this conspiracy. "Can you use those codes?" he asked urgently. Ivy nodded towards the store manager's computer behind the counter. "I need to get to that computer. I can send everything to the newspapers, to the police, to everyone." It was insane. She was 3 years old. But as Damien looked into those dark eyes, his eyes, he saw an intelligence that was both beautiful and terrifying. "Okay, baby," he made the hardest decision of his life. "Daddy's going to get you to that computer." He stood up, still holding Ivy, and walked out from behind the pillar with his hands raised. The soldiers immediately trained their weapons on him, but they didn't fire. "I surrender," Damien called out. "Just don't hurt my family." The scarred soldier smiled triumphantly. "A wise choice, Mr. Cross." But as they approached, Ivy whispered something in Damien's ear that made him smile for the first time since this nightmare began. "Daddy," she said, "I already sent the files." While they were talking, I used the store's Wi-Fi and my perfect memory to access everything. The whole world is about to know what they did. Outside, the sound of real police sirens was growing louder, along with news vans and federal agents who weren't part of the conspiracy. The scarred soldier's face went white as his radio crackled with panicked voices reporting that classified files were being broadcast on every major news network. "You little bitch," he snarled, raising his weapon towards Ivy. But Damien was already moving, and this time he wasn't holding back. The war for his family had just begun.